All right. Well, it's 3:30, so we're going to go ahead and get rolling. Thank you all for being in the room, and thanks to everyone who's joined us online. Today we're going to hear from Britt Weiser. He is the state conservationist with the NRCS. I actually don't know how long you've been with the NRCS. Only a mere 35 years, so he's a little bit fresh, a little bit green, but he's going to do his best today.
This coming across all right? All right, very good. Well, thank you very much for having me for your seminar today. I'll give you just a little more about where I've been, what I've done. I've worked in 3 states, so I started out my career in Kansas. That's where I was born and raised. Worked in the field office there. Actually worked in the county just across the line from Nebraska, from Superior, Nebraska, in Jewell County, Kansas. And then 1998, thought I wanted to see what another state was all about. And so I moved to Illinois, and I was a area agronomist up there, worked a lot with nitrates up there. We got nitrates here and still working with nitrates. Worked there for 11 years and then came to Nebraska in 2009. First as a field office manager. I'll show a picture of the state towards the end of my presentation on kind of how we're organized, but I was responsible for 32 field offices in the central part of the state. And then since 2015, I've been in my current position as a state resource conservationist. Basically, I supervise 8 technical specialists that have statewide responsibilities in a variety of disciplines. On my staff, I've got a wildlife biologist, forester, agronomist, water quality specialist, 2 archaeologists, conservation planning specialist, the Rangeland Management specialist, and a brand new one we just hired in January, a prescribed burn specialist, which I think is unique. I think we're the only state that I'm aware of that has that, and I'll tell you why in a bit, why we went with that position. So I'm going to quickly go through and give you a little whirlwind tour of history of how NRCS started, a little bit about our concept of locally led conservation, which anybody in this room or anybody that wants to weigh in, you have that ability to do so. Talk a little bit about our technical assistance we provide to landowners and producers, our financial assistance programs, highlight a few of our initiatives, and then show you a little bit about how we're structured. So hopefully that gives you a really quick overview, and then leave some time for questions, hopefully. So basically on the left there, you can see this is a very simple way of knowing what NRCS is all about. I don't know if we call it our slogan, but it's helping people help the land. So we work with private landowners to address whatever natural resource concerns that they have on their land. Our mission there is we deliver conservation solutions so agricultural producers can protect natural resources and feed a growing world. And then our vision there is a world of clean, abundant water, healthy soils, resilient landscapes, and thriving agricultural communities through voluntary conservation. So we're not a regulatory agency. We're voluntary, so a fair amount of salesmanship is needed with landowners and producers to encourage them to adopt various conservation practices on their land to address their concerns and maybe a broader societal concerns. So for those that don't know, our agency began in the Dust Bowl back in the 1930s. Wind erosion was a very visible problem in the country. High temperatures, a lot of drought led to a lot of wind erosion. And the legend has it that Hugh Hammond Bennett, who founded the Soil Conservation Service at that time, he was petitioning Congress in 1935. And rumor has it, or legend has it, that he waited specifically because he knew this big dust cloud was going towards Washington, D.C. It was making its way there, and he timed the congressional hearing so that when this dust cloud was darkening the skies in Washington, D.C., he was saying, we need a Soil Conservation Act and establish this agency. And sure enough, the Congress quickly passed the Soil Conservation Act, and President Roosevelt signed it in 1935. Actually, our name in the very beginning for just 2 years was the Soil Erosion Service, and then it changed in 1935 to the Soil Conservation Service. We were renamed in 1994 to the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and that was a lot better fit because we'd moved beyond just soil conservation into flood prevention and a whole lot of other things that I'll share with you that we work out there on the private land with. Also, a key thing in 1937 occurred, and it's called the Standard State Conservation Districts Law that was signed by President Roosevelt. And this really led in the very beginning to what we call locally led conservation. We didn't call it that back then, but we do now. And I'll show you here in a bit how we're structured that way. So today, there's still some reservation on the part of private landowners in rural areas with a federal agency coming out and working with them. It was especially that so 90 years ago. And so it was believed by President Roosevelt, USDA, et cetera, that if they had a local entity that formed, the Soil Conservation District formed, and developed a work plan of the problems they had in their county, then invited the Soil Conservation Service in, that would be a more effective model than just the federal agency showing up and saying, we're here to help you. So that was there from the very beginning. We now call this locally led conservation. So again, it started in 1937 with this, with the law that enabled these soil conservation districts to form. And here in Nebraska in 1938, just 1 year after that law was passed, Papio became the first conservation district in Nebraska. And Nebraska is unique if you're not aware of, but in 1972, there was a big reorganization that occurred where all of the conservation districts, along with some irrigation districts and other special use local units of government, were combined into 23 natural resources districts. But those natural resources districts still have inherent within them the soil conservation district authority and responsibilities that they had there in the beginning. And the NRDs chair the 23 what we call local work groups that provide input into USDA. So if you know the NRDs, their boundaries are on hydrologic unit areas, and we have just squared that off for our purposes of administration on the county lines. But here are your 23 natural resource district boundaries that NRCS uses for our boundaries as well. And each one of those has a local work group, and the public is invited to come to, they must meet at least once a year. They can meet as many times as they want, but to come together at least once a year, talk about the natural resource concerns they have in their area and how they would like to see USDA programs work to address those natural resource concerns. So if you're interested in when these meetings will occur, contact your local NRCS office if you're out away from Lincoln and want to attend their meeting. Also, we're set up on the statewide basis, and so we have what is called a state technical committee, and their role is to provide advisory input to the state conservationist of NRCS, and they meet quarterly, and we give them a lot of program information, what's going on, and if there's some key decisions to make, ask for their advice on that. Also, we have divided the state technical committee up into some subcommittees where we can do a deeper dive into some of those things. They could be a subcommittee if you're interested in participation on just a particular program, which I'll talk about here in a bit, like EQIP, CSP, or easement programs. If that's what you're interested in, just specific programs, you could come to those. Or if you're interested in specific types of things like forestry, water quality, wildlife, you can come to those. And in fact, on the water quality one, Katie here is a co-chair of that water quality subcommittee. And then a brand new one that we just formed about a year ago, there's a renewed emphasis on reaching out to our urban areas and small scale agriculture, making sure that our USDA programs are meeting their needs as well. So we formed a subcommittee to provide advice on what's needed there. So that's how you can get involved. We do value the input into how we use our USDA programs to address those natural resource concerns that are out there. So a little bit about NRCS assistance. So we offer what is called financial assistance and technical assistance. All of our assistance is free of charge. It's voluntary. We have no regulatory power, and we work on privately owned land. There's a lot of agencies that work on public land. We work with private landowners. So some of the things that we do with technical assistance is simply one-on-one advice with landowners on how to address whatever natural resource concerns that they have. Our agency has a wealth of soils information. Our agency mapped the soils across the entire nation, and we have soil surveys that are now on the web, and it's called the Web Soil Survey, that you can go and find out what soil is in some locations, some of the interpretations or qualities of that soil that can help make decisions, help communities, etc. And right here in Lincoln, we actually have the National Soil Survey Center. So a national center of NRCS is right here in Lincoln with many experts on soils information. We develop conservation plans where we work with a farmer or rancher to customize a plan for their operation, depending on what they would like to do. And I'll talk about that a little more. We also work in larger, helping with larger watershed scale plans, whether that be to address a water quality problem or other larger kind of scale problem that is out there. We can develop watershed plans, recommend solutions then that various landowners can choose from to address a concern, whether that be atrazine or whatever the concern would be in that watershed. We design conservation practices. We follow up with the producer on the installation. We conduct informational meetings, field days. That's just a short list, but it gives you an idea of what we try to do to get conservation on the land just from our advice. But then we have several programs we provide financial assistance on, basically trying to offset the cost of conservation practices that the producer would apply so that we encourage them to adopt that conservation practice. We got a variety of programs I'll talk about here. In the environmental quality incentives program is probably one of the more well-known ones, where we cost share or provide payments to producers to install conservation practices on their land. This regional conservation partnership program is relatively new in the last 10 years or so, where partner agencies can partner up with us and design a program to get conservation on the land. For example, the Nebraska Forest Service has an RCPP project with us to address trees, and timber stand improvement and some of those kind of things. Conservation stewardship program, and we got easement programs. I'll touch on those here in a little bit. We talk about working with the natural resources. This is what we work with. Like every good thing, we have an acronym. So SWAPA, soil, water, air, plants, and animals. So we work with in soil health, soil erosion, soil compaction, water quantity, water quality, air quality, greenhouse gas emissions I'll talk about, plants and animals. A lot of times we work with livestock projects or with wildlife projects. And then I think in the 1990s we added energy there. So energy conservation, working on those kind of things, and the human considerations with all of that. So I throw around the term resource concern quite a bit. So here's the definition that we use for a resource concern. It's an expected degradation of the soil, water, air, plant, or animal resource base to the extent that the sustainability or intended use of the resource is impaired. So soil erosion, there's a certain amount of soil erosion that is, quote, tolerable, and you can still have sustained use of that soil. So we we estimate the soil erosion as we work with producers, and if it exceeds a certain amount and they want to reduce that, we work with them on it. Water quality, as you know, it depends on the use of the water. So if the water is going to be used for drinking water, let's say it's groundwater, there's a 10 part per million nitrate level that impairs that water to be used for drinking water. Wildlife, we've got wildlife habitat evaluations that we do to determine if there's the right habitat mix out there to sustain the wildlife population. We have soil health assessments we conduct. We have rangeland health assessments we conduct to point out to the producers if there's some things there that could be improved upon and see if that's what they would want to work on. So this is really at the heart of our technical assistance. We have a week-long training that we conduct with new employees on the NRCS planning process. We've been using this planning process for 50 years or more. And it's basically got 9 steps to it, kind of 3 phases here. Makes a lot of sense. There's nothing magic about it, but it really provides a framework to properly think through each step of this planning process to then provide the best information to the producers on how to address their resource concerns. So first, we start off with identifying the problems. We're out there on the land with the producer, looking over their land, assessing it, and seeing what all problems are out there. Then the second step is to determine the objective. The producer determines the objective. In other words, we identify all these concerns. Maybe there's 10 concerns, but there's only 2 that they want to work on at this time. That's their choice. And to what degree do they want to address it? How much money do they want to spend? So we work with them to determine what's their objective here, and then that drives the rest of the planning process. So once we know what they want to work on, we then do a thorough inventory and analysis of their soils, their water, all of the resources, the rangeland, everything they have, and then we start talking to them about various alternatives or options to address those identified problems. And we help them evaluate those, providing them economic considerations, how well this practice works versus this one. And then ultimately they make a decision, and we put their decisions in a conservation plan, the practices that they want to put on their land and when they want to do those. And then we help them implement the plan, and hopefully we have the time to get back and evaluate it. That's really where you grow as a conservationist. You got to get back out and see if your plan really worked with how that producer installed everything. So that's the real foundation for our technical assistance, and we really drill that in to our employees. So a conservation plan is basically the producer's objectives and the analysis that goes into that. We provide them a lot of information, a lot of maps, soils information, do a lot of inventories, economic work, and so forth. And again, it's voluntary. We provide them with this plan. They could decide to implement it all, part of it, or none of it. You know, it's really up to them, but we want them to have a good plan on how to move forward on addressing things on their farm and ranch. One thing that our agency takes great pride in is called the Field Office Technical Guide, and this is kind of our foundational source of technical information that we work with our clients with. We base all of our information as much as we can on the most current science. So we really rely upon the land-grant university and other sources of current science. And if you can search for this, it's a public website, the Field Office Technical Guide. This is what the page looks like. You can go to any state, look at their information. It's organized into 5 sections, which kind of is alluded to there at the bottom. I'm going to focus on section 4, which is where our conservation practice information is in. So if you click on section 4, and then you go down on the left-hand side there, the conservation practice standards and support documents, right below there, you can see a start of an alphabetical listing of our conservation practices. And we got, I think, over 100 practices in there. You can see here, access control, access road, agrochemical handling facility. So you can scroll down there to the conservation practice you're interested in. I just picked cover crop here, thought that might be something of interest. Clicked on that, and then you'll see in the middle of the slide there, the type of files that you may find in there. And on the right-hand side, I've kind of got a shorthand of how you can determine what that file is. So when you see in the name of the file, so that first one listed is 340, that's a practice code number, Nebraska NE, and then CPS is Conservation Practice Standard. So this lays out in usually 2 to 5 pages of exactly how to implement that practice, what's required to implement that practice successfully. There's a document in there that has SOW in the title. That's for statement of work. It's kind of a task list. We started doing these when we had outside individuals that would work with farmers on installing or working with them on conservation practices, and it provides a good task list of everything that's involved in doing that work. Or if you work with agreements, you call it deliverables, that sort of thing. So IR is implementation requirements. Quite honestly, I wish they hadn't changed the name. They did that about 4 or 5 years ago. We used to call it job sheets. And what that is just a simple sheet that we fill out for a producer that explains exactly what they need to do to implement the practice. So on cover crops, we would write down, plant this many pounds, 20 pounds of cereal rye, 2 pounds of turnips and so forth. Plant it during these dates, plant it, ½ inch deep or whatever. Anything that they need to do very simply that they could either do themselves or take it somewhere and say, I need this much seed, and purchase what they need to implement the practice. So those are what we would give a producer. PO is a practice overview. So if you're wanting just very basic information, it's like a 1-pager for each of these practices. That's a good source there. Guidance document, you'll see that in some of the practices, but not all. Basically, if there's a really quite a lot of technical information, we may put together a guidance document to make it easier for our employees to sort through the most current science and different things they need to consider about that practice. Another great source here, our public affairs specialists across the nation have been doing a great work over the past few years, filming 1 to 2 minute videos on each of these conservation practices. And these will be in different states, but if you search for Conservation at Work, it's a YouTube channel, and there's currently over 55 videos in there of conservation practices. So if you want to just go in there and see real quickly, what is that practice all about? This is a really good website to do that. So moving into our programs, probably one of the more familiar ones is what we call the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, where you hear people say EQIP. So basically, again, it provides a payment to producers for installing certain conservation practices to offset the cost or incentivize them to install that on their land. This gives you an idea. I didn't get my slide updated for 2023, but in fiscal year 2022, we received in Nebraska a little over $25 million through this program. We work with 930 producers across the state. We actually enter into contracts, so they determine what practices they want to install, and then we obligate that money in a contract, and as they complete those practices, pay them for that. And that was on over 400,000 acres. I also listed another bullet point here that at the beginning of the year, we tend to have it decided out what all we're going to spend our money on, but we hold a little bit back because you never know what's going to happen. So in 2022, some of you may know, we had some wildfires that affected a few counties in the southwest part of the state. So we were able to react to that and use 1.4 million of our 25 million to help people with that were impacted by that wildfire. Just to give you an idea, the most popular practices that were funded in EQIP right now, cover crops topped the list. A lot of interest with cover crops. Of course, with Nebraska being the #1 irrigated state, irrigation water management is very popular, putting in the soil moisture monitors and doing precise irrigation. And with a big rangeland state, it's probably not surprising that we spend a lot of money in rangeland. They're very popular with producers to put in more watering facilities so they can get better distribution of their grazing on their pastures. Brush management, we'll touch on this in a little bit. We have a big problem in Nebraska with the encroachment of eastern red cedar in our grasslands. And so brush management is a very popular practice to try to get rid of those trees. Fencing, now fencing is not the boundary fence, that's the responsibility of the producer, but this is cross fence so that they divide the pasture up so they can manage it more effectively. And terraces are still a popular practice that takes up a fair amount of money through there. Conservation stewardship program is a little like EQIP. The difference being is producers that are enter into a CSP contract, they're rewarded for their previous stewardship efforts, conservation they put on the land, plus additional things that they're willing to put on their land. These are 5-year contracts, and again, it's voluntary what they want to do there. Some popular things there are similar to what I showed on EQIP, although you start seeing some other ones like nutrient and pest management. Nutrient management, we've got producers that are wanting to go a little bit higher level, you know, maybe use the sensor technology, some of those kind of things to improve their nutrient management. We also see a lot of interest in wildlife type planting, so tree and shrub establishment, pollinator seedings, those kind of things. Then we have easement programs, and basically the landowner retains ownership of their land, but they provide an easement that takes away the ability to do certain things. For example, if they want to protect wetlands, there'd be an easement that this stays in a wetland and doesn't get farmed and so forth. Another one, in fact, we were just talking at lunch, you know, with urban sprawl, we have an easement program where a person can get paid to enter into an easement and it stays in agricultural land. And so it's not developed. And so I worked in Illinois before, and it's very popular up in the Chicago area too. If farmers wanted to make sure that their farm stayed in, you know, the family and stayed a working farm, they can enter into an easement program and do that. So again, it keeps ag land as ag land, and I just kind of described those two components there. What's the payment there? So it basically goes through a fair market value, and then there's a 10 or whatever % subtracted from that, because the producer does keep the land. They just lose the ability to do different things with the land. And those are, you can see the regions in Nebraska, and we look at appraised values of that land and make those kind of determinations. Here's just a map that shows in 30 years, kind of where you see easements, see a fair part of the state has one or more easements that are out there. In fact, 745 easements that we did in those 30 years across the state. A lot of those are wetlands. You see the 130,000 acres, I think a little over 100,000 of that was wetlands, where people wanted to put an easement and protect the wetlands. So just real quick, a snapshot of our accomplishments in FY22. We did write conservation plans on over 1.4 million acres. We applied conservation practices on over 1.2 million grazing land acres, improved soil health there on 690,000 acres, irrigation water management, you can see there, and wildlife habitat improved on over 100,000 acres. This is a very popular program, the Conservation Reserve Program. However, it's administered by the Farm Service Agency, but we provide the technical assistance to that. So Farm Service Agency develops the contract with the landowner and provides the rental payments, and then we make the technical recommendations on the planting of the grass and forbs and trees and whatever needs to go on out there. This is a 10 to 15 year contract, where basically they take out of production environmentally sensitive land and like I said, plant more permanent cover depending on the kind of practice they're looking at. Something that the universities have participated in, and UNL has certainly participated on this conservation innovation grants part of our programs. It's a competitive grant program, basically trying to encourage the development of new conservation technologies and approaches, going to be on the cutting edge with some things, and all non-federal entities and individuals are eligible to apply for this. And I just put one example. I know the university's gotten several conservation innovation grants from us. Right now, one that I'm very much interested in is a $1.2 million conservation innovation trials project that Laura Thompson is coordinating, and basically trying to use sensor technology and other things to more precisely apply nitrogen fertilizer to the crop. So trying to go after this nitrate concern with technology, and she's working directly with farmers to try these strip trials on their farms. I'm going to highlight 5 of our major initiatives just to give you the scope of some of these current big problems or things that we're involved in addressing. A lot of times what we work with is what the individual producers come in and say they're interested with, and we certainly will work with them on whatever they have. And then we have some of these bigger scale ones that we kind of drive it a little bit. So you may have heard of the Inflation Reduction Act. It was signed into law last year, and this is putting a huge amount of additional conservation funding into NRCS, $19.5 billion more dollars over the next several years in our program. So most of our programs are getting a big slug. To tell you the impact in Nebraska, last year, our normal EQIP I mentioned was about 25 million. This last year, they just got rolling. We got an extra 2.5 million. So that's an extra 10%. This year, an extra 29 million. So more than doubling what we have for EQIP. It's going to put a strain on us because we got a doubling in funding, but I can tell you we have not doubled our employees. So they're going to be behind the desk more than they want, trying to develop contracts with these producers to spend this money wisely. But basically, it doesn't really create any new programs. The practices that we work with farmers on have been providing climate benefits, and this is very focused and focused on additional money to expand upon those practices and improve the climate. So all this money has to be spent by 2031. So if we're developing 5-year contracts, I'm saying it will probably hit the high water mark about 2026, and then it'll gradually start coming down the other side. So about 3 years, we're going to be pushing pretty hard on this. So it focuses on climate change mitigation, on greenhouse gas emission. It doesn't focus on like resiliency, although some of our practices do help with the resiliency side, but it's really focused in on the 3 greenhouse gases that agriculture can make an impact on: CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. And if you're interested in the practices, I think it's about a 4-page thing. If you just do a search for climate smart mitigation, you'll find it. But it basically is focused in several areas there. Your soil health kind of practices, whether it be no-till and cover crops and so forth, that's a great way to sequester carbon dioxide. So that's we're focused on that. Nitrogen stewardship, working with people on their nitrogen programs, helps with the nitrous oxide emissions. Livestock waste is associated with methane emissions. So there's some things that we can do there with them. Grazing land is a great sink for CO2 and sequestering carbon. So the healthier we can make the grazing land and the deeper and more prolific the roots, we're going to sequester carbon. Forestry as well, and energy conservation. So if we make some of these things more energy efficient, so for example, if somebody puts in a more energy efficient irrigation pump, that will reduce emissions, because the less energy you use, the less emissions that you will have. Another big one we just kicked off last year is the Great Plains Grassland Initiative. So with a state where grazing is as important as it is in Nebraska, this whole thing with woody encroachment is a big threat. In fact, it's the #1 threat to grasslands in the Great Plains, woody encroachment, primarily eastern red cedar. And I put this slide in because I really think what we're experiencing here on what Dr. Twidwell here at the UNL has said is the collapse of our grassland biome here in the Great Plains is equivalent to the dirty 30s and the wind erosion that we experienced and the devastation that caused. So on the right there, if you're not familiar with looking with photography there, that green that you're looking there is a grassland, and the green is likely mostly eastern red cedars that are taking over that grassland. Here is, we're working on woody encroachment statewide, but we got a little extra money that we're emphasizing in these 4 areas that you can see in green here. We're really trying to get going. And the big thing is trying to reintroduce fire. There are ranchers using fire, but we're never going to get ahead of it until we get most people using fire on a periodic basis. Dr. Twidwell is working very closely with our agency and with experts in 4 states, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, in addition to Nebraska. And they've written on the left there a publication, I think it's about 30 or 40 pages, called The Great Plains Grassland Biome. Great read there if you really want to get the most current scientific principles on how we're going to defeat and make headway on this woody encroachment problem. The next one there, Oklahoma State has a really good publication there on reducing woody encroachment in grasslands. And then you can see down below, we've got a lot of partners. There's a lot of interest in turning back the tide of this woody encroachment. So we're collaborating with numerous partners here to make that happen. Basically, what we're trying to do here is change the approach. This series of pictures here showing from 2010 to 2021 came from one of our employees out in the North Platte area, where you can see what happened on a project that he worked on and why we need to change our approach. So 2010 is what that picture looked like with all the eastern red cedars there. The producer came in, signed up for EQIP on brush management to cut down the trees. You can see most of the trees got cut down. Some of the steeper slopes, sometimes it's difficult to get out there and get them on those. But then look 10 years later in 2021, all those little cedars, probably even more than was out there to start with. And so this is the issue. We're never going to get ahead of this thing just cutting down trees. We've got to reintroduce fire in landscapes that haven't had fire for many years. We had wildfires historically that took the trees out. When the settlers came out, there was very few trees out here on the Great Plains. And it's because we've stopped fire that we have this problem. So we want to manage for what you see on the left, intact grassland. We tend to be attracted to the picture on the right. You know, that's got the biggest problem. We ought to start there. We need to get taken care of that. We need to do the opposite. We've been doing that on the right, going out and cutting those trees down. It's almost like chasing your tail, just like you saw all those small cedars, and you're just constantly going after that. You're not making any headway. So you need to start in the intact grassland, like you see on the left, and expand it out and keep making headway. And once you get all of these seed-bearing trees out of your grassland and you protect it, you don't have that problem there anymore. So that's the concept. And so intact grasslands or core areas is what we're talking about. Start with your core areas, and those are intact grasslands that serve as an anchor point for then to move out and address woody encroachment beyond that. So here's a diagram that Dr. Twidwell used in that publication. And so you can see the idea there is to start with your intact core and move out. Don't get attracted to those areas in red, which is where you have the highest encroachment. You'll get there eventually, but you need to start with the intact core and keep gradually making gains as you expand that core. And he likened this to medical care, that if you do this approach with the intact core, it's like preventive care. You're going out there and you're trying to do it. It's a lot less expensive to do when you don't have much woody encroachment and you got a high success rate. If you just call the ambulance when you got the heart attack or your problem, you're not fixing or doing it in the right way. So we're really excited about this approach. And quite honestly, this is why I mentioned that I have a new addition to my staff starting in January, and he's a prescribed burn specialist. his sole job is to try to get out there and encourage more prescribed burning on the land. So what he's doing, he's working with partners, he's working with prescribed burn associations, which are voluntary landowner associations that come and help each other burn, because it takes 20, 30 people out on these larger burns to do it right. He's training our employees so they feel comfortable and competent in recommending burning to our clients and so forth. So this is a big undertaking, and we're just ramping up on our approach on this. Soil health, you probably heard that term quite a bit. I put on the screen here, if you haven't seen this before, the 4 principles of soil health. The ones on the right, we've been working with for decades. No-till farming, minimizing disturbance and maximizing your soil cover. We probably have not thought through the left-hand side as much, but with cover crops, if you get into a corn soybean rotation, you're only got living roots out there for maybe 6 months at the most out of the year. And so when your living roots die off, the source of food for a lot of your microbes also declines, and you have a crash in your microbial population. So you want to maximize the amount of time that you have living roots out there, and that's another key function of cover crops. In addition to providing cover of the land, they provide root exudates that provide food for the microbial population, which is really instrumental in the glues that they develop that provide structure to the soil and improves infiltration and good things in the soil. Also, we're finding out more and more that, one way to maximize biodiversity, the more diverse you are in the crops above the ground, the more diverse your microbial population is. And, we may be locked into a corn soybean rotation, but by adding a lot of different cover crop species, we can still add biodiversity into the system. And I won't read this slide off to you, but there's just tremendous benefits to soil health from reducing erosion, improving water infiltration. We can reduce flooding by a tremendous amount if we could just get 1 extra inch of water to go into the soil instead of running off the surface. We had a situation down by Hebron a few years back, side-by-side fields, where a guy had tilled his land and another guy did no-till and cover crops, and they had, I think, 11 inches of rain down there. And it just washed that other field away, and you could barely see where the water moved anything on that. A tremendous 11 inches. So if we could just get an extra inch or 2 out of these bigger rains to go into the soil, it'll reduce flooding by quite a lot. Lots of benefits from soil health. And this is another great collaboration with the university. In 2016, we established 17 demonstration projects across the state, and we collaborated with Dr. Bache and her grad students on a whole bunch of monitoring and soil inventories that they did. Publications were made on what they did there, and just a lot of information was learned. So that was a great collaboration. Here's a slide that just shows you lots of other collaborative projects we have at the university. Deep soil carbon assessment, soil color versus soil organic matter, cover crop variety trial, soil health gap map project, and kind of a new one here, as I'll talk about in a bit. We're getting into the urban areas, but a soil health initiative in the urban areas. So a lot of great collaboration between NRCS and the university. Source water protection, I've worked with this a bit. Basically, in the 2018 Farm Bill, they required 10% of our EQIP funding to be used to protect drinking water sources for our communities. And in Nebraska, 99% of the communities rely upon groundwater as a source of their drinking water. And so this is a map of the state. The red dots are a little over 500, I believe, community wellhead areas, the areas that provide the recharge for the public wells. Then you see in the gold color is some phase 2, 3, and 4 nitrate areas. If you're familiar with that concept, the NRDs manage nitrates in their areas. And these are some areas that are elevated, and so they have some additional requirements of producers in those areas. And then the diagonal lines there are some water quantity areas where there's been declines in the water table, and we want to work with practices that will improve upon that. So when we spend our money here, we try to spend all of it in the wellhead areas if possible. But if we don't have enough applicants in the wellhead areas, then we can spend the money in these other nitrate or water quantity management areas. So what we're trying to do here is practices that reduce nitrate leaching and also work with water quantity. So irrigation practices do both. Obviously, converting flood irrigation to sprinkler or subsurface drip is much more efficient. And not only that, and reduces pumping, but not only that, but it reduces the depercolation and leaching of nitrates that comes with flood irrigation. So it's a great practice, and there's still a fair amount of flood irrigation out there that could be converted. Irrigation water management, I mentioned before, the soil moisture sensors and making the irrigation scheduling as efficient as possible. Cover crops are key to nitrate sequestration after harvest. If there's some extra nitrogen left out there and nothing taking it up, it's just ripe to move down into the groundwater. And of course, working with farmers on their rate and the timing of their nitrogen fertilizer application. So that's what we're focused on there, to protect the sources of drinking water for our communities. And then finally, as I mentioned, urban agriculture is a bit of a new initiative here in Nebraska. And Brock Johnson, he's a long-term field office employee, but he came on now as our urban conservationist, and he's really hit the ground running. He's been doing this for about a year, and he's already got 30 small-scale urban ag equip applications. We've signed up over 100 new customers. They basically have to go in the Farm Service Agency and get a farm number and a track number so they can be eligible for our programs, and we've got 100 already signed up that way. Worked with over 150 underserved individuals, and then we formed a new Nebraska Urban Ag and Conservation Council so that we can collaborate and gather feedback on key things that we need to be doing there. So urban ag and small scale ag, if they get the farm number, track number, they are eligible for our programs as well, the EQIP, the CSP program, and so forth. And here's just a picture of a customer that we worked with, Beavers Produce up in Rogers, Nebraska. And the plants are grown inside of, you see the plastic there, what we call a high tunnel. So we can cost share on the conservation practice of a high tunnel and help those producers that are wanting to be doing this kind of agriculture. And so we've developed a very easy one-pager for non-traditional agricultural producers of how they can go into the Farm Service Agency and get signed up for a farm number and a track number. And finally, who's doing all this work and how are we organized? So here's the state here, and we have 76 field offices across the state. So almost every county, there's I think 92 or 93 counties. Almost every county has a field office. You get into some real rural areas in the sand hills, and not every county has a field office there. But that's where the real work occurs, one-on-one with the field office staff and those farmers and ranchers. Then we've organized the state into 3 areas, the west, the central, and the east. As I mentioned before, I used to manage the 32 offices in the central part there. And then you see the star there at Lincoln, and that is where our state office is located. I work out of our state office there. So typical positions we have in our field office. These are probably the most typical. We have more than this, but we have a soil conservationist position. And basically that requires a degree in soil conservation or related field like agronomy, soil science, forestry, ag ed, etc. There's some semester hour requirements for courses. If you're interested, 30 semester hours in a natural resource or ag field, and at least 12 of those hours have to come from a combination of soils and crops or plants. This is kind of a quick version, so don't just go off of this slide and say, I've given you perfectly what you need. Do a search. It's on OPM, Office of Personnel Management, but if you just look up soil conservationist requirements, you'll find those specific curriculum requirements. Another common employee type that we have is a range management specialist. And we get a lot of UNL grads. We get a lot from Chadron State on range management. And they have to have a degree in range or related discipline with at least 42 hours in plant, animal, soil science, etc. And we have soil conservation technicians that do not require a degree. So we have those positions in our field office. Other ones as well, but those are your most common positions. And then at the area and the state level, as I mentioned, I supervise 8 technical specialists like agronomy, archaeology, forestry, wildlife biologist, water quality, etc. We have engineers. We currently don't have an economist. We need to get an economist hired. And people who specialize in our programs and provide that guidance, etc. So that's kind of what we tend to do. So at my staff, we basically provide guidance and training on the most current science and how we implement these conservation practices. So with that, that was kind of a quick 30-minute whirlwind. I'm sure that there's things that I didn't cover. So I guess at this time, I don't know, Katie, how we want to do questions or?
Absolutely. See the first question up here.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I have a few questions, but the one that comes to mind, because I've been hearing about it a few times, is the issue of small producers in an economy that's corn and soybeans. I think a lot of issues of drift of pesticide and destroying crops that aren't and not really allowing other kinds of agriculture. Is that an issue that you guys deal with? And what are the solutions to that? Because it seems that we're trapped in this system, as you mentioned. You know, you suggested something that suggested we're stuck, but are we really stuck? And how do we deal with that? Is that what's your experience with that and your suggestions on that issue?
Yeah. So, you know, when I say stuck, I just kind of mean that there's a lot of things lined up that kind of keep us locked into the corn soybeans rotation because of the use of corn and beans and so many things and so forth. As far as directly on the drift, so we do work with farmers on the conservation practice called pest management. And one of the things, one of the payments we can provide is for producers that use what are called smart sprayers. So, you know, they can turn off nozzles and not have the overlap and some of those kind of things. My agronomist was just at a meeting a week or two ago, and he was telling me that they're also using sensors to detect, you know, where the weeds are and so forth. And he said that there was a demonstration that was put on here a couple of weeks ago where somebody, I believe, put on only about 20% of the herbicide that they normally do. So Banville is one that's a big drift problem. So if farmers can get this smart sprayer technology, and instead of just broadcasting across the whole field in case there's weeds there, but actually sense the weeds and spray only where it's needed. And if you could reduce your application by 80%, like this example I just gave, that'll go a long way to addressing the drift.
Yeah, I've heard, thank you. I've heard also that volatilization and the stuff descending later is also an issue. Is that something that you have an answer for?
Well, we would have to have a way to directly, if you're talking about working with producers to do some things, we have to have some specific technology or something that they could use, and then we would make a payment to offset some of the cost of that to encourage them to go that route. So we're always looking at what is out there to address the problem, and then how can we encourage or incentivize producers to use that new technology or that technique or whatever.
Is there anything to help the people who are damaged by this? Because,
well, I mean, unfortunately, maybe the only way is lawsuits. You know, if somebody is negligent and makes those crops, you know, adversely impacts their neighbors, but I'm not aware of anything more. I do know when I was in school that they talked about, I mean, Banville has been around forever, that if you spray at night or towards the evening, you reduce your volatility tremendously overnight. So just the timing of when you put on the Banville or some of these volatile chemicals can make a big difference as well.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, thank you. I had a question related to the voluntary nature of the programs. 930 seems like a large number, but also we're a large state spatially. So I was kind of wondering like how popular the voluntary programs are in terms of like percentage of actual participants to percent like all the total producers in the state. And then related to that, I was curious if you'd seen any trends in participation, either in number of participants or in what kind of programs they're coming to you and asking about over your time.
That's a good question. I don't have the total number of producers right on the tip of my brain of how many producers there are in Nebraska, but we don't reach a huge percentage because we're just limited with the amount of funds that we have. I will tell you this, that typically we have 3 times the applications and we have funding. So they're very popular. If you divide it out, 930 contracts in roughly 90 or so counties, you're talking about 10 per county. So you can do a quick assessment that we're not able to reach a high percentage of those producers. As far as interest and trends, I think it's been pretty steady, of what they're interested in. It just changes over the years. We spent a lot of time in the 1980s and 90s with soil erosion, terraces, and some of those practices were more popular. Today, with some of the larger equipment, farmers don't want terraces as much because if they're spaced 120 feet apart with large equipment, sometimes it's a lot more difficult to farm that field. So they're going different directions like no-till and cover crops and other ways to address the erosion. There's always been a big interest in Nebraska in irrigation type practices, how they can be as most efficient as possible with irrigation. But it changes as we work with it. And we're hoping, for example, that we really encourage widespread adoption of going after the woody encroachment because it's a big issue. If you see your pasture every day, you don't really notice it. But when you see photographs, there's some great photographs out there about the same picture of some farmstead and it's got the pasture in the background. And then 50 years later, it's kind of one of those things that sneaks up on you and all of a sudden you got this major problem. So these problems continue to evolve and the interest goes right with that of what we work with. But with our funding levels, we aren't reaching a high percentage. Like I said, if you do the math, on average, we may have 10 per county. Some counties will be far less. Some may have 30 contracts or whatever, but you can do, I think a typical county will have maybe 1,000 producers. Now those contracts will last 5 or could last up to 10 years. So they could get enough money to take care of things over a 5 to 10 year span. And then you get another group that, and so you'd have probably in an average office, you may have 100 to 150 active contracts at any one time, kind of a thing. Did that help get at what you're after? Okay.
That was a great answer. Any last questions? Yeah.
Another question about the CRP program. I find it a little bit hard to penetrate because it's all on private land and the records are a little bit hard to find, but is there a move towards changing the practices or policies? Because my sense is there's a variety of different definitions or practices applied to CRP lands. And I don't know if that's changing or has changed, but it can be everything from a monoculture to a very diverse native plant community. it's defined a lot of ways, and it's not clear to me how much evaluation of those different choices comes into the program, because they're all, I mean, I'm just not, I don't know that much about it. So
Yeah.
is that changing, and what is the status of that in terms of getting information on the benefits of these different approaches to CRP lands?
I may have to probe you a little more on the end of that, but let me take the first part. So the CRP, or Conservation Reserve Program, has evolved quite a bit since it came out in 1986. It started out as being a major, well, at that time they wanted to take agricultural land out of production and help with some of the low prices. And you coupled that with, it was really focused on soil erosion. So large blocks, whole fields, that sort of thing was in the early days. And I think, and this is when I was in the field office, I think we only had, 10 or 12 different kind of practices to choose from. Now it's over 40 different practices. There's been a movement, I would say, the last 10 years to shift a little bit from these whole blocks, maybe a whole section of land, to more targeted conservation. So, filter strips or riparian buffers, really focused in on the water quality along our streams, pollinator plantings, smaller scale type things. And so I see that that trend continuing. It seems to be a very responsive program to new and innovative practices. For example, Iowa got a lot of press about these prairie strips, is what they call them. I don't know if you read or seen anything about those. So within a year or two after that, they integrated that practice into the CRP program. So it continues to evolve on that. Now, you asked a specific on how we can know the benefits of some of these. Could you expound on that, what you're looking for there?
Yeah, I just was curious, to what extent is research on the benefits incorporated into the program? Is it directly or indirectly incorporated? It sounds like the program is evolving a lot, which suggests that that it is being incorporated. But from the perspective of someone who's done research, I find it very hard to approach, because it's all in private land and it's very difficult to even get the information on what's been done. I mean, there's unless you actually know all the people involved. It's a question I've had, and I'm just unclear how much that is part of the program, and at what level.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would have to steer you towards the Farm Service Agency. I know that they have some things going on with research on CRP. They actually administer the program and would be the one that you'd have to work with on that. I know also that, the information that the producers share with us and we work with them on is subject to the Privacy Act, but there is a provision in the Farm Bill, they call it 1619, section 1619, that there's a process you can go through with the agency to be able to get access to some of that information. And then, of course, you have to agree in the way that you would use the information and so forth. So I guess for more details along those lines, I would encourage you to get with the Farm Service Agency, and they've got their state offices right here in Lincoln as well.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
All right, let's give Britt a round of applause.